The unthinkable happened today. The World Trade Center, both towers, gone, and we are all witnesses to it, and to some degree we are all victims.
We were just dragging people along with us, and then when we came outside, it just blew, the tower blew, and I found the mask on the floor as I was crawling.
Those are the descriptions from law enforcement officials about the events that played out today. It seemed as if the terrorists had a script to follow and wanted to make sure the world was watching, striking at the towering symbol of America's dominance on the world stage. The FBI says an American Airlines jet, Flight 11, out of Boston and headed to Los Angeles, slammed into the North Tower.
The aftermath of the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center, now a part of history.
On Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, at approximately 5:45 a.m., Mohammed Atta and Abdulaziz Al-Amari would pass through security at the Portland International Jetport in Maine. They would board a commuter flight to Boston Logan International Airport in Massachusetts, where they would then board American Airlines Flight 11. The plane contained 81 passengers and 11 crew members, along with 76,400 pounds of fuel. At around 7:59, Flight 11 would take off, bound for Los Angeles, California. At around 8:14, 5 hijackers on board, including Mohammed Atta and Abdulaziz Al-Amari, would rise from their seats, stabbing Daniel Luen, a passenger on board, and take over the cockpit. Daniel Luen served in the Israeli army and is believed to be the first victim on September 11th. At 8:19, a flight attendant on board named Betty Ann Ong would report to ground personnel that the plane had been hijacked. Then, at 8:21, Flight 11's transponder would be turned off, which made it very difficult for the plane to be tracked. 3 minutes later, at 8:24, hijacker Mohammed Atta would make a call to the passengers.
We have some planes, just stay quiet and you'll be okay. We're heading to the airport. Nobody move. Everything will be okay. If you try to make any move, you'll injure yourself and the airplane. Let's stay quiet. Nobody move, please. We are going back to the airport. Don't try to make any stupid moves.
At least he thought he was speaking to the passengers, as he accidentally pressed a button that transmitted this to air traffic control, accidentally warning them of a potential attack. Around this time, the plane would take a sharp turn over New York State, heading south for New York City. At 8:44, a different flight attendant on the phone with air traffic control stated that the plane was descending at a very fast pace. They also noted that they were flying, quote, way too low. Then, at 8:46 a.m., the unimaginable would happen. Flight 11 would crash into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York between floors 93 and 99, killing around 92 people on the plane, hundreds in the World Trade Center, and trapping everyone above the 91st floor, as all 3 escape stairways would be cut by the plane. The clear, sunny blue sky would be obstructed by smoke, flames, shrapnel, and papers scattered from the explosion. Onlookers would be confused and horrified by the sight, as it was unclear at the time what was happening. The majority of people would assume it was a freak and tragic accident. Perhaps a small plane had accidentally crashed into the tower. Only a few on the ground who were informed of the hijacking knew in all probability that this was an attack. As for the rest, they would have to wait to know for sure. At approximately 8:15 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 would take off from Boston, also headed for Los Angeles. It's believed that between 8:42 and 8:46, this plane would also be hijacked. The main hijacker, Marwan El-Sheheh, along with 4 hijackers, would force their way into the cockpit, supposedly stabbing multiple members of the flight crew along the way. The hijackers had knives and threatened the passengers and crew with a bomb. They would enter the cockpit, kill both of the pilots, and take over the plane. At 8:52, passenger Peter Hansen would call his father, stating that he believed the plane had been hijacked and that someone had been stabbed. Along with Hansen, a flight attendant would call United Airlines and confirm their suspicions that 175 had been hijacked. Unlike Flight 11, however, the transponder of the plane would be left on, allowing air traffic control to view the flight path. Flight 175 would fly south towards Virginia, when it would suddenly make a roughly 180-degree turn over New Jersey and head for New York City. Then, at 9:03 a.m., the suspicions of the first crash being an accident would unfortunately be crushed. Flight 175 would meet a devastating end, crashing between floors 77 and 85. Roughly 65 would be killed on the plane, and likely hundreds more in the building itself. Unlike the North Tower, however, this attack would only cause 2 of 3 stairways to be blocked, thus allowing some fortunate people the ability to escape. Believe it or not, the president of the US at the time, George W. Bush, is actually in a Florida schoolroom as these attacks are happening. At 9:05, former White House Chief of Staff Andrew Card would walk into the room and whisper, "A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack." After this, at 9:19, United Airlines dispatcher Ed Ballinger would send a message to the planes still in the air that he was covering, warning them of potential hijackings and attacks. Then, at 9:25, the Federal Aviation Administration would order an unprecedented nationwide ground stop that would halt all flights from leaving the ground in an attempt to stop further attacks. Additionally, at 9:42, the FAA would order all planes currently in the air to land at a nearby airport. This order would clear almost every plane from the air, but a few planes were still flying, one of which was Flight 77. At 8:20 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 would take off from Dulles International Airport, heading once again for Los Angeles. On board were 64 people, around 58 passengers with 6 crew members, including 5 hijackers. At about half an hour after takeoff, the hijackers would rise from their seats and once again take control of the plane. At around 8:54, the plane would take a sudden, roughly 90-degree turn, heading south. Then subsequently after, the plane's transponder would be turned off, and so it's unclear the exact path the plane took. However, it's believed that the plane took an almost 180-degree turn over Ohio and Kentucky before heading straight for Washington, D.C. At 9:12, flight attendant Renee May would call her mother and state that a hijacking was taking place. Her mother would then contact American Airlines to tell them about the hijacking. At this point, they believed the plane had crashed. A bit later, Barbara Olson would call her husband and state that the passengers had been, quote, herded to the back of the plane by hijackers. Later, at 9:32, the plane would be detected by air traffic controllers at Dulles, but it would be too late to stop the plane, as about 4 minutes later, Flight 77 would fly towards Washington, D.C. and crash into the Pentagon. The crash would occur in between the first and second floors of the building, and the explosion would cause significant damage and decimate the plane itself. All people aboard the plane, along with over 100 people in the Pentagon, would be killed. Now this nightmare isn't over. There was a fourth and final plane, and that is Flight 93. Between 7:03 and 7:39 a.m., Ziad Jarrah and 3 other accomplices would pass through security at the Newark International Airport in New Jersey. They would board United Airlines Flight 93, from 7:39 to 7:48 and would seat themselves in the first class section of the plane along with 6 other passengers. There would be a total of around 37 passengers on board along with 7 crew members. The plan was to depart from Newark 10 to 15 minutes past 8, but due to increased traffic, it would take off at 8:42, heading for San Francisco, California. At 9:26, the pilot of 93, Jason Dahl, would receive the message sent out by Ballinger and would respond asking for clarification. Then, 2 minutes later, at 9:28, Flight 93 would be hijacked. The hijackers would don red bandanas and force their way into the cockpit. Amidst the struggle, the captain or first officer would send out 2 radio transmissions. In the first, someone is heard yelling, "Mayday," along with obvious sounds of a struggle. In the second, someone is heard yelling, "Get out of here," 3 times. Then, at 9:32, a hijacker that was likely Ziad Jarrah would state, "Hear the captain, please sit down, keep remaining sitting. We have a bomb on board, so sit." At 9:35, flight attendant Sandy Bradshaw would call the United Airlines maintenance facility and state that the hijackers had threatened them with a bomb and that they had knives and had killed a fellow flight attendant. Then at 9:37, many passengers would begin calling their families and state that they were on a hijacked plane. Mark Bigham would call his mom and state that the plane was hijacked and that the hijackers had a bomb. Tom Burnett would call his wife, where he would say that they were hijacked and that a passenger had been stabbed. His wife would tell him about the earlier attacks on the World Trade Center, which, in the biggest understatement ever, would likely have been terrible news for Burnett. He would also later state that a group of passengers were planning something. Jeremy Glick would call his mother-in-law and wife and state that the passengers were considering, quote, rushing the hijackers. At 9:39, air traffic control would pick up a transmission from the pilot stating, "I would like you all to remain seated. We have a bomb on board, and we are going back to the airport, and we have our demands, so please remain quiet." At 9:41, the plane's transponder would be turned off, but the plane could still be tracked using primary radar and visual sightings. At 9:50, Sandy Bradshaw would call her husband and state that the passengers were planning to attack the hijackers, including throwing hot water on their faces. At 9:54, Elizabeth Wainio would call her stepmother and state that the passengers and crew were going to attack the cockpit. At 9:55, Todd Beamer would be on a call with Lisa Jefferson, a GTE operator, where they had prayed together, specifically the Lord's Prayer. He would then be heard saying, "Are you guys ready? Okay, let's roll." Then, at 9:57, the fight begins. The plane would begin shaking rapidly in response to the attack, and the hijacker at the controls would begin to angle the plane up and down. There was loud screaming from both the hijackers and the passengers as they fought for control. Then, in an open field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, the plane would flip upside down and plunge nose first into the ground. At 10:03, United Airlines 93 would crash. Everyone on board would be killed instantly, but no one on the ground would be harmed. What makes 93 so much easier to understand and place times for is the sheer number of phone calls made during the flight compared to earlier planes. There were a reported 3 calls made on Flight 11, 5 calls made on Flight 175, and 3 calls from Flight 77. By contrast, Flight 93 had an estimated 37 calls from passengers and crew. With this abundance of calls comes a lot more explanation of the hijacking and knowledge for the passengers about the other hijackings. All this culminated in a battle for control that ultimately thwarted the hijackers' plans. If the passengers hadn't fought back, the leading idea is that the hijackers were either going to hit the White House or the United States Capitol. Given that the hijackers attempted to fly to DC, leads many to that conclusion. While people above the crash in the North Tower were completely trapped, many assumed that they would be able to escape because of the integrity of the towers themselves. Believe it or not, those who constructed the towers had confidence that they could survive a crash from a Boeing 707 flying at 600 miles per hour. However, the attack on the South Tower would be conducted with a Boeing 767 with a full tank of fuel, flying at around 590 miles per hour. So while the towers were theoretically built to survive an event like this, it would be likely that collapse would occur. Another factor that should be taken into consideration is the fuel. Because all of these planes were bound for the West Coast, the planes had a large amount of fuel on board to accommodate. While about 1/3 of the fuel would be consumed on impact, a large chunk of the rest would run down the hollow part of the buildings. This would cause fires on multiple levels and spread heat to the tower's infrastructure. This will be important to keep in mind for later. Both the North and South Towers of the World Trade Center would remain upright and intact for about 56 minutes after the South Tower attack. Firefighters, news reporters, and civilians would take to the streets to try to get a view of this horrific spectacle. However, this curiosity would lead to a massive problem because at 9:59 a.m.,
this is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents, and you can see the two towers. A huge explosion now, raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way!
the South Tower would collapse in on itself like a stack of cards. This destruction would cause massive amounts of dust and debris to be thrust on the city around it. Those who were outside would have seconds to minutes to flee to shelter or be covered by unbreathable dust. The collapse would also lead to many buildings around the tower to be hit by large pieces of debris, taking chunks out of buildings and injuring many.
It broke our windows, and the whole cloud came in, the cloud of debris and dust came in our apartment, and it was so thick that we literally couldn't breathe. We thought that we were going to, we didn't think we were going to get out of the building. It felt like it was choking us. I mean, I remember thinking, well, if I don't breathe, I'm going to die. If I do breathe, I'm going to die. It just felt like death.
Seeing videos of people fleeing from the explosion is truly the stuff of nightmares. The pure speed of the dust is a testament to the sheer amount of force being exerted by the crumbling tower, and, in fact, the collapse of the South Tower led to an estimated seismic wave equivalent to that of a magnitude 2.1 earthquake. All this to say, this collapse was a big deal, not only to those in the building itself, but also those on the ground. Approximately 800 people in or around the tower would be killed by this collapse. On the other hand, the North Tower, despite being hit earlier than the South Tower, would remain upright for 29 minutes after the South Tower's collapse. But at 10:28, the North Tower would collapse as well. The North Tower would be the most devastating, with roughly 1,600 lives lost as a result of the attack. Looking at these videos and hearing me talk about these collapses likely will make you confused. The way the towers fall looks nothing like you'd expect a collapsing building to look like. Not only was a lot of the collapse covered in smoke, but the towers seemed to fall in on themselves other than toppling over. Now, why this occurs is both simple and complex, but in simpler terms, after the planes had hit the towers, the subsequent explosion would spread fire and hot fuel to a lot of the building and down the hollow parts of the tower. This would heat up and deform the supports for the building and would thus weaken them. These weakened supports would be unable to hold the gravitational force applied to them from the top of the tower, and they would break. The tower would then collapse vertically and would crush the floors below them, causing that weird domino effect. As for why the South Tower collapsed later than the South, well, Wikipedia's got you covered. The North Tower lasted around 46 minutes longer than its twin. This was because Flight 11 struck more or less in the center, causing more symmetrical impact damage to the North Tower's core and leaving more of its structural support intact. The fires also took more than an hour to spread to the south side of the building, where there was fireproofing damage. Traveling at 440 miles per hour, Flight 11 crashed through floors 93 and 99, leaving only 10 floors worth of structural weight pressing down on the damaged, burning section of the North Tower. So, in comparison to the South Tower, Flight 11 would hit the North Tower higher up and slower compared to Flight 175, which was going faster and hit the South Tower lower. After the collapse of both of the towers, a significant part of New York's skyline would be fundamentally changed. In the play Come From Away, which documents the events of one of the redirected planes, a significant line has always stuck out to me. I look out the window at this view I've looked at my whole life, and now a part of it, something's missing. The collapse would leave America without words, shattered and confused. After the crashes and collapses, almost 3,000 people would unfortunately lose their lives. America clamored for answers. Who was behind it, and why did this happen? There were 19 hijackers during the September 11th attacks, and all had been found to be connected to a militant organization called Al-Qaeda. This organization was centered around Afghanistan and was founded and ruled by a man named Osama bin Laden. He was the ringmaster and mastermind behind the whole 9/11 plot, and he, along with the rest of Al-Qaeda, had strong anti-foreign beliefs, especially towards the US, and they would even declare a holy war against the United States. They would cause multiple different terrorist attacks leading up to and after 9/11 against the US, Kenya, Turkey, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, and other countries with whom they disagreed. Following 9/11, Osama bin Laden would become one of the US government's biggest targets. They wanted to defeat Al-Qaeda, and they believed the best way to do that was to kill bin Laden. What would follow was roughly 10 years of trying to track down bin Laden, in which they eventually would. And on May 1st and May 2nd of 2011, Navy SEALs would invade his compound at night in Abbottabad, Pakistan, and shoot Osama bin Laden, killing him and ending the 10-year manhunt.
The United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, and a terrorist who's responsible for the murder of thousands of innocent men, women, and children.
One question that can be raised when talking about the hijackers is, why did bin Laden choose to hit the World Trade Center and the Pentagon? While the World Trade Center was a very easy target to hit, the Pentagon was quite the opposite, so why go out of the way and choose these buildings? Well, it's impossible to know for sure, but it seems it was mainly for symbolic purposes. After all, the World Trade Center and the Twin Towers were seen as a symbol of economic prosperity for the United States, and showed the US's international economic might. The Pentagon, on the other hand, could have been seen as a symbol for militaristic greatness and strength. Because Al-Qaeda had such hatred for the US and nations like it, destroying symbols of strength and prosperity made sense to them. Not only would it cripple the US physically and economically, it would also hurt the US mentally and spiritually. This reasoning pushes the idea that Flight 93 was going to hit the Capitol or White House because they were symbols of political greatness and symbols of democracy. So that would mean that all 4 attacks would hit the US economically, militarily, and politically. One can only imagine how truly hurt the US would be if 93 had hit its target. Some of the outcomes of 9/11 would be quite evident. An estimated 2,996 people would lose their lives on September 11th, and around 6,000 would be injured. The 9/11 attacks is the biggest terrorist attack in the history of the world when comparing fatalities. By contrast, second place is 1,200 fatalities lower than 9/11. That's a huge margin. These are numbers that cannot be scoffed at. This attack was a big deal. Additionally, because the hijackers were so easily able to get on and take over the planes, airport security would be completely changed. Not only would people be checked more thoroughly, but new technologies would be implemented to catch any sort of weapons passengers could be taking on the flight. Before 9/11, passengers could have a knife on board as long as it was under 4 inches. After 9/11, however, you can't bring any knife on a plane in your carry-on. Checks for explosives have also become much more advanced, with new technologies and careful examinations to prevent any sort of explosive from entering the plane. Additionally, drinks have been limited due to the possibility of liquid-based explosives. Even the planes themselves have been changed, as the doors to the cockpit have been extremely reinforced. All this was done by TSA to do whatever they could to stop another hijacking incident like that of 9/11. But while security has become much better, that doesn't mean hijackings have been completely eliminated. While very rare nowadays, they do happen from time to time. In 2014, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 702 was hijacked by the co-pilot, but luckily no one was hurt, and the co-pilot was arrested. Similarly, the leading theory in the disappearance of Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 in 2014 is also a pilot-induced hijacking, though this is yet to be confirmed. More recently, in 2023, Horizon Air Flight 2059 almost had their fuel cut off by an off-duty pilot riding in the cockpit. Luckily, no one was hurt. You may have noticed a few connections between these examples. It seems the majority of modern hijackings are done by pilots, and they usually end without any lives lost. That's how hard security has cracked down on hijackings after 9/11, and how influential the event truly was in respect to flights. September 11th was a day in America that would live in infamy. Thousands of people would lose their lives. New York, the United States, and even the whole world would be changed forever. Part of the reason I wanted to make this video, even though it's very different from my usual content, is that I recently watched Nat Geo's documentary on 9/11 and I realized how little I actually knew about the event. The way it's taught in schools or talked about by your everyday person would make you think that all that happened was the planes crashed and people died. But there's so much more to it. After researching and looking into 9/11, I've realized how much history and personal stories can be learned from this single event. It could probably be documented and discussed for years. So many lives would be changed by this event, and I've learned so much about the day that I wouldn't have if I hadn't taken the time to look into it. I truly hope you enjoyed this documentary and timeline of the day. If you want me to make more documentaries on other historical events, let me know. This is my first one after all. Thanks for watching, and God bless.